Hello and welcome. This is the third meeting of the School of Materialist Research Special Program, Marx and Engels and the Dialectic of Theory and Practice, led by Reid Kane. To date, and through the series so far, he's really brilliantly moved us through the critical terrain of reconstructing Marx and Engels' project, thinking through, among other things, the agential capacities of the working class, and a radical gesture that returns us really to the root and branch basis of social critical work and setting the capacious mode Marx and Engels took up into motion, uncompromisingly, and this is thinking back towards last week, uncompromisingly centering totality in the work of Marx's vision for the formation of a critical democracy to come. Today, we look forward to rising and waking the dead, thinking with revolution and against the counter-revolutionary impulse with full historical force together. I'm Jacob Henry Levitin, a new member of the School of Materialist Research, program coordinator of the Humanities Institute, and senior global futures scholar at Arizona State University. And I want to remind us that our organization, the organization bringing you today's conversation, is the School of Materialist Research, or the SMR, an education and research inter-university platform that offers integrated credit programs, seminars, special programs such as this one, and research initiatives that address the many materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. The SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities, Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. The SMR was, is, and continues to be an exceptional global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the nexus of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. And so we're delighted you found it fit to continue spending your time with us today. And with all that, I wanted to signpost an announcement forthcoming from us that will be for a summer school with the design department at Goldsmiths University, London. The topic will be speculative and critical materialisms in design. So if you appreciate Marx and Engels' designs in this program, and I'm sure that you do, you'll no doubt be delighted to extend those lines of thought in that space as well. Details forthcoming. And with that, I'll turn things over to Reid to start things off. Take it away.
Thank you, Jacob. So I'm going to so first I should say I wasn't particularly happy with the way the previous lecture turned out. As I had mentioned at the beginning, I was struggling to condense a lot of material into an hour. And I think I kind of psyched myself out, and I didn't really, in my own estimation, I didn't successfully cover what I really needed to cover to set up the third lecture as initially planned, and the rest of the series. So I've decided to restructure things a bit, and I'm going to cover the period preceding the revolutions of 1848 again today, but I'm going to cover a lot that was left out last time and try to clarify some things that I think were not clear in the previous presentation. And I will cover the revolution of 1848 next week. Unfortunately, not in as much depth as I might have liked, but I think it'll end up working out better that way. So I also wanted to mention at the outset that I have a lot more material prepared for these lectures in general than I'm able to present, and I do intend to put that out there in some other form, put out there the material that was not covered here, likely on my own YouTube channel, but we'll see about that. That'll be a concern after the series is concluded. So, all right, without further ado, moving on to the lecture. In March of 1843, following the suppression of the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx wrote to Ruge concerning their plan to move to Paris to co-edit a new journal, complaining that Germany is sunk deep in the mire and will sink still deeper. The mantle of liberalism having been discarded, the most disgusting despotism in all its nakedness was now disclosed to the eyes of the whole world, sealing its fate, the impending revolution. After Ruge responded with pessimism, Marx assured him that while centuries of barbarism may have reduced Germany to a dehumanized world of political animals who know of no other function than to be obedient, devoted, and attentive to their masters, the reform movement having proven an unsuccessful attempt to abolish the Philistine state on its own basis. Nevertheless, I do not despair of it. On the contrary, it is precisely the desperate situation which fills me with hope. Marx admits that the self-confidence of the human being, freedom, has first of all to be aroused again in the hearts of these people, as this alone can transform society into a community of human beings united for their highest aims, into a democratic state. Historical development itself seemed to be leading in this direction, Marx writes. The enemies of Philistinism, in short, all people who think and who suffer, have reached an understanding for which previously the means were altogether lacking. And even the passive system of reproduction of the subjects of the old type daily enlists recruits to serve the new type of humanity. The system of industry and trade, of ownership and exploitation of people, however, leads even far more rapidly than the increase in population to a rupture within present-day society, a rupture which the old system is not able to heal because it does not heal and create at all, but only exists and consumes. But the existence of suffering human beings who think and thinking human beings who are oppressed must inevitably become unpalatable and indigestible. Marx believed he and Ruge as thinking human beings who are oppressed, both of their periodicals having been heavily censored and ultimately banned, had a clear role to play. To clarify this historical process, so that the struggle of suffering human beings who think did not needlessly squander its forces in senseless, useless revolts which are drowned in blood, as he would later put it. In that regard, the dismal state of Germany provided an advantage. The longer the time that events allow to thinking humanity for taking stock of its position, and to suffering humanity for mobilizing its forces, the more perfect on entering the world will be the product that the present time bears in its womb. In September, Marx further assured Ruge that their journal would answer a real need in providing a new rallying point for truly thinking and independent minds, and addressing the greater confusion, the state of general anarchy that prevailed among the reformers, if it embodied a new trend that did not dogmatically anticipate the world as the philosophers had done hitherto, and instead sought to find the new world through criticism of the old one. If constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear that we have to accomplish what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be. Rather than raising any dogmatic banner, Marx urged we must try to help the dogmatists to clarify their propositions for themselves, including the various proponents of communist and socialist doctrines. Moreover, to influence our contemporaries, we must take the subjects which form the main interest of Germany today, in whatever form they exist, as our point of departure. He goes on, reason has always existed, but not always in a reasonable form. The critic can therefore start out from any form of theoretical and practical consciousness, and from the forms peculiar to existing reality, develop the true reality as its obligation and its final goal. Hence, nothing prevents us from making criticism of politics, participation in politics, and therefore real struggles, the starting point of our criticism, and from identifying our criticism with them. In that case, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. We do not say to the world, cease your struggles, they are foolish. We will give you the true slogan of struggle. We merely show the world what it is really fighting for. And consciousness is something that it has to acquire, even if it does not want to. The reform of consciousness consists only in making the world aware of its own consciousness, in awakening it out of its dream about itself, in explaining to it the meaning of its own actions. Hence, our motto must be reform of consciousness, not through dogmas, but by analyzing the mystical consciousness that is unintelligible to itself. It will then become evident that mankind is not beginning a new work, but is consciously carrying into effect its old work. Thus, Marx proposed that the trend of their journal would be self-clarification, critical philosophy, to be gained by the present time of its struggles and desires. This is a work for the world and for us. It can be only the work of united forces. After arriving in Paris that November, Marx quickly became acquainted with the French Democrats and Socialists and leaders of workers' secret societies, and attended meetings of German and French workers' groups, which provided profound confirmation of his developing conception of the impending revolution. As he wrote to Ludwig Feuerbach the following August in a failed attempt to solicit him to publish in the Jahrbucher, you would have to attend one of these meetings of the French workers to appreciate the pure freshness, the nobility which bursts forth from these toil-worn men. The English proletarian is also advancing with giant strides, but he lacks the cultural background of the French. But I must not forget to emphasize the theoretical merits of the German artisans in Switzerland, London, and Paris. The German artisan is still, however, too much of an artisan. But in any case, it is among these barbarians of our civilized society that history is preparing the practical element for the emancipation of mankind. While Marx may have begun to anticipate the significance of the proletariat beforehand, it was only after encountering the studiousness, the craving for knowledge, the moral energy, and the unceasing urge for development of the French and English workers firsthand, that Marx recognized the suffering human beings who think, with whom he hoped to unite thinking human beings who are oppressed. The fact that the German Revolution had seemingly lagged behind those of England and France reflected the self-contradictory development of modern bourgeois society, which was not merely national but international. In the Dutch and English revolutions of the 17th century, the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy, the church, and royal absolutism was limited by the extent to which bourgeois society had been able to develop. In coming into conflict with these limitations, it forced them to change, as the power of the ruling classes increasingly depended upon the wealth accumulated through the production and exchange of commodities. Yet it could not yet do away with these fetters altogether. This revolution continued into the 18th century with the wars of the British Empire of Liberty against the empires of slavery, most importantly that of France. But this only intensified the unresolved contradiction within British society, culminating in a civil war, the American Revolution, in which the bourgeois radicalism in which bourgeois radicalism came into conflict with the growing conservatism of the British state, which in turn ignited the French Revolution, whose radicalism would only escalate in confronting France's far more deeply entrenched, but also more brittle, ancien regime. Counter revolutionary opposition from within and without drove increasingly radical parties to the leadership of the revolution, culminating with the Jacobins. Yet the Jacobins were unable to overcome this pressure and fell from power, as Marx puts it, because they confused the ancient, realistic democratic commonwealth based on real slavery with the modern, spiritualistic democratic representative state based on emancipated slavery, bourgeois society. They remained stuck in the ideas of the old world order because the new world had not yet begun to take shape on its own basis. At most, they could recognize in civil society the abstract negation of the existing world, as reflected in the abstract conception of the egoistic individual in civil society, as an atom, unrelated, self sufficient, wantless, but nonetheless, quote, each of his senses compelled him to believe in the existence of the world and of individuals outside him. And even his stomach reminds him every day that the world outside him is not empty, but is what really fills every activity and property of his being. Every one of his vital urges becomes a need, a necessity, which is self-seeking, which his self-seeking transforms into seeking for other things and human beings outside him. But since the need of one individual has no self evident meaning for another egoistic individual capable of satisfying that need, and therefore no direct connection with its satisfaction, each individual has to create this connection. It thus becomes the intermediary between the need of another and the objects of this need. Therefore, it is natural necessity, the essential human properties, however estranged they may seem to be, and interest that hold the members of civil society together. Civil, not political life, is their real tie. It is therefore not the state that holds the atoms of civil society together, but the fact that they are atoms only in imagination, in the heaven of their fancy, but in reality beings tremendously different from atoms. Only political superstition still imagines today that civil life must be held together by the state, whereas in reality, on the contrary, the state is held together by civil life. That's thus Marx. Jacobins were in the grip of just such a superstition in seeking to revive the liberty, justice, and virtue of ancient times and restore ancient democracy. They thus fell prey to the terrible illusion that to recognize and sanction in the rights of man modern bourgeois society, the society of industry, of universal competition, of private interest freely pursuing its aims, of anarchy, required them to annul the manifestations of the life of this society in particular individuals, and simultaneously to want to model the political head of that society in the manner of antiquity. The Jacobins did not fall due to incorrect ideas, but due to the immaturity of the radical party reflected in these backward looking ideas. not yet capable of leading beyond the crisis in practice, and therefore bound to misconstrue it in theory. As Marx later wrote during the Revolution of 1848, while the bourgeoisie was the class that really headed the movement in 1789, as in 1648, it did not stand as a separate class as against this movement, as quote, the proletariat and the non bourgeois strata of the middle class had either not yet any interests separate from those of the bourgeoisie, or they did not yet constitute independent classes or class subdivisions. Therefore, where they opposed the bourgeoisie, as they did in France in 1793 and 1794, they fought only for the attainment of the aims of the bourgeoisie, even if not in the manner of the bourgeoisie. All French terrorism was nothing but a plebeian way of dealing with the enemies of the bourgeoisie: absolutism, feudalism, and philistinism. Hence, the revolutions of 1648 and 1789 did not represent the victory of a particular class of society over the old political order. They proclaimed the political order of the new European society. The bourgeoisie was victorious in these revolutions, but the victory of the bourgeoisie was at that time the victory of a new social order. Bourgeois revolutions were therefore not mere intrigues in which the old rulers were replaced by new rulers, but epochal transformations. The political revolution merely a necessary moment in a developing social revolution, the point at which it consolidated itself by breaking through inherited limitations that had become impediments to its further progress, and constitutes new forms suited to its continuing development. They reflect not the narrow interests of one class against all others, but the needs of the world at that time, the victory of the present over the past. Yet the bourgeoisie had always conjured up the spirits of the past to their service during such epochs of revolutionary crisis, the awakening of the dead serving the purpose of glorifying the new struggles, magnifying the given task in the imagination, finding once more the spirit of revolution. The Renaissance conjured the spirits of classical Greece and Rome to oppose the immediate past of the Middle Ages. The Reformation and the Dutch and English revolutions resurrected the spirit of early Christianity to combat Catholic decadence. The discovery of the New World rediscovered the spirit of man in the state of nature before crossing the threshold into the barbarism which civilization in the Old World was still struggling to overcome. The very notion of revolution contained the metaphor of turning the wheel of history forward, leaving behind the miseries of yesterday in order to return to the point of origin, to begin again at the beginning, to clear away the artificial contrivances that humanity had imposed upon itself for millennia and restore our natural condition of freedom, to build a new world, new institutions, in which universal freedom would replace universal slavery. For the revolutionary bourgeoisie, the laws corresponding to such a free society were natural laws, independent of the influence of time, therefore eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus, there has been history, but there is no longer any, as Marx puts it. Yet Marx did not regard such fatalism, at least in its classical form, as exhibited in the realm of political economy by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, for example, as apologetic and vulgar, opposing the possibility or necessity of further development, but as reflecting the revolutionary struggle of the bourgeoisie against the relics of feudal society, including a proletariat which is itself a relic of the proletariat of feudal times. Bourgeoisie are indifferent to the sufferings of the proletarians who help them acquire wealth. This is because they have no other mission than to increase the productive forces and to give a new upsurge to industry and commerce, just as the economists have to show how superior are bourgeois production relations. Poverty is, in their eyes, merely the pang which accompanies every childbirth in nature as in industry. Likewise, the proletariat that takes part in this struggle and is absorbed in this feverish labor experiences only passing, accidental sufferings, and itself regards them as such. Thus Marx. It is only with the triumph of the bourgeoisie over feudalism, after all the old economic forms, the corresponding civil relations, the political state, which was the official expression of the old civil society, are smashed, that the bourgeoisie develops its antagonistic character, though this is at first more or less disguised and latent, as there develops in its bosom a new proletariat, a modern proletariat, and with it, a struggle between the proletarian class and the bourgeois class. Only then does it begin to become clear that the production of wealth is simultaneously the production of poverty, and along with the development of the productive forces, a force producing repression. The moment this development begins in earnest, the revolutionary class becomes conservative. Thus, the revolutionary critique of the past begins to be vulgarized by the Romantics, who, from their elevated position, cast a proudly disdainful glance at the human machines who manufacture wealth. The humanitarians, who seek to separate the good side from the bad side, failing to see them as inextricable, and that the bad side always, in the end, triumphs, producing the movement which makes history by providing a struggle. And the philanthropists that want to realize theory insofar as it is distinguished from practice and contains no antagonism, to turn all men into bourgeois, imagining that they are seriously fighting bourgeois practice, whereas they are more bourgeois than the others. Yet at the same time, there emerge the socialists and the communists, the theoreticians of the proletarian class. If the French Revolution gave rise to ideas which led beyond the ideas of the entire old world order, these ideas were nonetheless utopian, pointing to a good place that existed no place. Utopia itself, the work of Thomas More, stood at the threshold of the bourgeois epoch, just after the discovery of the New World, just before Luther initiated the Reformation, authored by one of the greatest minds of Renaissance humanism, as a critical indictment of the bad side of English society by contrasting it to a vision of an idealized society based upon community of property. Marx writes, ideas can never lead beyond an old world order themselves, cannot carry out anything at all, as men are needed who can exert practical force. Yet, in pointing beyond the old ideas, they form the basis of criticism that can galvanize the discontents with the old world into a struggle against it, initially in partial and momentary conflicts, but it progressively assumes clearer outlines as these conflicts end in defeat, compelling those engaged in struggle to clarify their shortcomings and to sharpen their criticisms. Thus, the theorists of the struggling class have only to take note of what is happening before their eyes and to become its mouthpiece, to arrive at genuine science, which is produced by the historical movement, and associating itself consciously with it, has ceased to be doctrinaire and has become revolutionary. The Jacobins gave way to the more conservative government of the Directory, which put an end to this illusion of the political enlightenment, which formerly had been overreaching itself and had been extravagant in attempting, in the terror, to sacrifice bourgeois society to an ancient form of political life. As Marx describes, a storm and stress of commercial enterprise, a passion for enrichment, the exuberance of the new bourgeois life, whose first self enjoyment is pert, light-hearted, frivolous, and intoxicating, a real enlightenment of the land of France, the feudal structure of which had been smashed by the hammer of the revolution, and which, by the first feverish efforts of the numerous new owners, had become the object of an all round cultivation. The first moves of industry that had now become free. These were some of the signs of life of the newly emerged bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is positively represented by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, therefore, begins its rule. The rights of man cease to exist merely in theory. Yet it is at the same moment that a new theory begins to take shape among the most consistent Republicans, which gave voice to the demands of the proletariat, though these demands, owing to the then undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone, had a necessarily reactionary character, advocating universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest form. Quote, the revolutionary movement which began in 1789 in the Cercle Social, which in the middle of its course had as its chief representatives Leclerc and Roux, and which finally, with Babeuf's conspiracy, was temporarily defeated, gave rise to the communist idea which Babeuf's friend Buonarroti reintroduced in France after the Revolution of 1830. This idea, consistently developed, is the idea of the New World Order. The counterpart of this end quote. The counterpart of this crude and reactionary communism, which contained the demand for real freedom and equality in an obscure, mystical form, was the undisguised despotism of Napoleon. Yet it was not the revolutionary movement as a whole that became the prey of Napoleon on the 18th Brumaire, but the liberal bourgeoisie. The liberal bourgeoisie were the far right wing of the revolution, that is, the most conservative party, typically representing those with the greatest vested interests, the most to potentially lose, hence most ready to seek compromise with the counter-revolution, to sacrifice their broader goals for immediate interests, even to betray the revolution. Under their rule, their antagonism with the proletariat began to develop, though this was initially an antagonism with the old proletariat, the relics of the old feudal society that sought to retain their antiquated position, the drawn from the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry. Yet the embryo of the modern proletariat was beginning to form, as the lowest among them, the day laborers who were more and more a fixture, an ever growing mass on which the development of industry depended. Those who owned no property, who had nothing to lose but their chains, were driven to the most radical conclusions, beyond even the democratic republicanism of the Jacobins, to the communism of Babeuf. This radicalism, while an early intimation of what was to come, was nonetheless reactionary, seeking to destroy the very conditions under which the modern class struggle would develop, the very same conditions that would be necessary to overcome this struggle, to do away with the divisions of society into ruling classes and working classes once and for all, the means of producing wealth in abundance, of reducing the burden of labor to the point that it ceases to be necessary to impose this necessity on anyone, such that society can make the slogan of the French socialist leader Louis Blanc into a reality, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. If Babeuf represented an elemental proletarian opposition to the liberal bourgeoisie, albeit practically premature and hence theoretically reactionary, what was new about this idea was not its conceptual content, but that it expressed a developing self-contradiction at the heart of the bourgeois revolutionary struggle. As Engels puts it, that democracy, the rallying cry of the petty bourgeoisie that took up the aims of the bourgeoisie in the most radical manner against the timid and conciliatory liberals themselves, is, like all forms of government, a contradiction, a contradiction in itself, an untruth, nothing but hypocrisy, theology, we Germans call it, at the bottom. Political liberty is sham liberty, the worst possible slavery, the appearance of liberty, and therefore the reality of servitude. Political equality is the same. Therefore, democracy, as well as every other form of government, must ultimately break to pieces. Hypocrisy cannot subsist. The contradiction hidden in it must come out. We must have either a regular slavery, that is, an undisguised despotism, or real liberty and real equality, that is, communism. And that's Engels just before he meets Marx, or meets Marx for the second time, their famous meeting in Paris where they form their partnership. And before he's kind of fully developed his sort of Marxist perspective, but nonetheless, while that betrays some of that quote betrays some of that, it also reflects a perspective that is core to Marxism as well. It's in a kind of rudimentary way. As real liberty and real equality were not yet possible, Babeuf could only envision these negatively, as the abstract negation of their false appearance. Hence, his vision of communism would have meant making the reality of bourgeois liberty and equality explicit as a self-imposed condition, the liberty to work or starve. Rather than having this condition imposed upon them by others, the workers would democratically impose this condition upon themselves. All members of society would equally be reduced to slaves of society as a whole. Babeuf's communism thus revealed the limited, self-contradictory character of this political and democratic communism. Napoleon embodied this same contradiction, but whereas in Babeuf the self-contradiction of the practical struggle for democracy, the fall of the Jacobins, pointed beyond itself theoretically, though in a purely negative manner, in Napoleon the self-contradiction of the theoretical aims of that struggle, as concealing the reality of servitude, pointed beyond itself practically, in rendering even the bourgeoisie slaves of society as a whole, as represented in the state. Quote, Napoleon represented the last battle of revolutionary terror against the bourgeois society, which had been proclaimed by this same revolution, and against its policy. Napoleon, of course, already discerned the essence of the modern state. He understood that it is based on the unhampered development of bourgeois society, on the free movement of private interest, etc. He decided to recognize and protect this basis. He was no terrorist with his head in the clouds. Yet at the same time, he still regarded the state as an end in itself, and civil life only as a treasurer and his subordinate, which must have no will of its own. He perfected the terror by substituting permanent war for permanent revolution. Napoleon rose to power out of the necessity of defending the revolution by defeating the forces of counter-revolution. Yet the counter-revolution was not merely anti-bourgeois, but reflected the conservative interests of the British state, which was likewise based upon the unhampered development of bourgeois society, though only so long as it remained subordinate to that state. Hence, it bankrolled the counter-revolutionary coalitions in what Marx called the anti-Jacobin wars, including the Wars of Napoleon. The Ancien regime had ceased to be a mere relic of the past, instead becoming an expression of the self-contradictory development of bourgeois society manifesting in the political sphere, the opposition of the social development of bourgeois production to the political idealism of the bourgeois revolution. Liberalism, which was supposed to subordinate the state to society, had become an alibi for the subordination of society to the state, and was likewise opposed by the same means. Thus, Napoleon despotically suppressed the liberalism of bourgeois society, the political idealism of its daily practice, as expressed by the ideologists, as well as its essential material interests, trade and industry, as pursued by the industrial homme d'affaires, whenever they conflicted with his political interests, that is, the interests of society as a whole embodied in the state, which in his own person, in Napoleon's own person, he still held to be an absolute aim in itself. Napoleon's defeat initially gave way to the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty, but the social basis of the state had fundamentally changed, as with the English Revolution. And as with the English Revolution, this restoration soon gave way in the Revolution of 1830 to the restoration of the liberal bourgeoisie in the bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe, quote, with the only difference that its political enlightenment was now completed, that it no longer considered the constitutional representative state as a means for achieving the ideal of the state, the welfare of the world, and universal human aims, but on the contrary, had acknowledged it as the official expression of its own exclusive power and the political recognition of its own special interests. The French Revolution had also galvanized the radicalism that in Britain had failed to mount a serious challenge to Parliament and the Crown to coincide with the revolt of the North American colonies, but which by the end of the 18th century was gaining new impetus from the emergence of the modern proletariat that accompanied the Industrial Revolution, leading to a decades-long struggle for electoral reforms that would break the aristocracy's monopoly in Parliament. This culminated in the Reform Bill of 1832, which expanded the franchise while retaining a property qualification for suffrage, and thereby, as Engels puts it, legally sanctioned the distinction between bourgeoisie and proletariat, and made the bourgeoisie the ruling class. During the same period, the progress of the Industrial Revolution led to a developing social crisis, the emergence of an ever-growing mass of propertyless laborers dependent upon employment for wages, whose constant growth drove down those wages, allowing industry to expand all the more rapidly, repeatedly culminating in crises of overproduction, in which the market could not absorb the products of industry, driving employers out of business and greatly expanding the industrial reserve army of the unemployed, whose poverty and idleness led to widespread degeneracy in the form of crime, alcoholism, prostitution, disease, an array of symptoms of social decline, um, summarized in the phrase the social question. This led, on the one hand, to the political conflict between the liberal bourgeoisie, who saw the problem rooted in impediments to commerce and industry that could put the poor to work, primarily posed by the expensive and restrictive political administration. And on the other hand, the philanthropically minded bourgeoisie and reactionary aristocracy that saw the problem as a lack of adequate poor relief. Yet it also led to the emergence of socialism, the notion that the problem could be solved through the conscious organization of the production process in the interests of society as a whole, the workers as well as the owners. In England, this notion was pioneered by a capitalist factory owner, Robert Owen, who initially, out of philanthropic motives, provided his workers with education and unemployment insurance and limited the length of the working day, doubling the value of his business in the process. Yet he was still unsatisfied that the people were slaves at my mercy, and reflected on the reasons for the discrepancy between his own wealth and their dependency. The radical and rapid increase in the productivity of labor made possible by the introduction of machinery, because of which 2,500 persons could produce what less than half a century before it would have required 600,000 to create. He asked himself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000? The answer, of course, was that it was appropriated by the owner of the machines as profit on his capital. Hence, he realized that if this new wealth had not been created by machinery, the wars of Europe in opposition to Napoleon and to support the aristocratic principles of society could not have been maintained. And yet, this new power was the creation of the working classes. That's Robert Owen. Owen was thereby led to the communist conclusion that the fruits of this new power, the newly created gigantic productive forces hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, could instead furnish the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined, as the common property of all, to be worked for the common good of all. Owen and his followers propagated his vision by producing literature, giving lectures, organizing associations to spread his message, and forming communist colonies to demonstrate his principles. Owen naturally sought to advance his cause by convincing the bourgeoisie of its merits on rational and moral grounds, but was consistently frustrated. He also unexpectedly attracted increasing interest and support among the working class. While Owen had tried to rally support for his new system of society by organizing colonies in the US, the proletarians in England began forming combinations to protect themselves against the tyranny and neglect of the bourgeoisie, to exploit their collective power in dealing with their employers, to regulate the rate of wages according to the profit of the employers, raising wages where possible, and counteracting the threat of wage reductions where necessary by exerting control in the labor market and stopping work if their demands weren't met. Engels recounts that when Owen returned to England after the failure of his American colonies consumed his fortune, quote, he turned directly to the working class and continued working in their midst for 30 years. He forced through in 1819, after 5 years fighting, the first law limiting the hours of labor of women and children in factories. He was president of the first Congress, at which all the trade unions of England united in a single great trade association. He introduced as transition measures to the complete communistic organization of society, on the one hand, cooperative societies for retail trade and production. These have, since that time at least, given practical proof that the merchant and the manufacturer are socially quite unnecessary. On the other hand, he introduced labor bazaars for the exchange of the products of labor through the medium of labor notes, whose unit was a single hour of work. Institutions necessarily doomed to failure, but that did not claim to be the panacea for all social ills, but only a first step towards a much more radical revolution of society. Thus, quote, every social movement, every real advance in England on behalf of the workers links itself onto the name of Robert Owen. Yet as the working class developed, so too did its antagonism with the working class. Owen still held the view that for his revolution to succeed, it would have to unite all classes in the common cause for reconstructing society, and that conflict between the classes would only undermine it. This notion was hotly debated within the Owenite press and inspired its participants to turn to the political economy of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The Grand National Consolidated Trades Union collapsed over this question, driving a wedge between the more radical workers aspiring to escalate the struggle to the point of a general strike that would force the capitalists to capitulate to their socialist aspirations, and the more moderate workers and middle class Owenites who recognized that strike action typically had ruinous consequences, which Marx and Engels agreed on that point, although that didn't necessarily mean it shouldn't be undertaken. As Engels put it, the Owenites understand, it is true, why the working man is resentful against the bourgeois, but regard as unfruitful this class hatred, which is, after all, the only moral incentive by which the worker can be brought nearer the goal. They preach instead a philanthropy and universal love, far more unfruitful for the present state of England. They acknowledge only a psychological development, a development of man in the abstract, out of all relation to the past, whereas the whole world rests upon that past, the individual man included. Hence, they are too abstract, too metaphysical, and accomplish little. Owen led his middle class followers to form a new organization that restricted itself to propaganda, that is, producing and distributing newspapers, pamphlets, and other literature, training lecturers to tour the country, organizing educational associations, opening meeting halls and reading rooms, etc., as well as the formation of friendly societies, fraternal organizations that benefited their members through mutual aid, primarily in the form of cooperative insurance and savings, though these also formed the basis upon which educational associations, unions, cooperative factories and stores, and political organizations would be formed. One such organization, formed by working class Owenites and veterans of the Reform Act movement, would be the source of the next major development of the working class struggle, when in 1838, the London Working Men's Association drafted the People's Charter, a list of 6 demands for democratic reforms that would do what the Reform Bill did not: give the working class the power to elect their own representatives to Parliament. As this class was rapidly growing, the Chartists believed that democracy would become the natural means by which to win their emancipation, by introducing the social reforms through which the reconstruction of society would begin. In the decade between 1838 and 1848, the Chartist movement rallied the British working classes to petition Parliament to pass the reforms listed in the Charter multiple times, with no success. This coincided with a series of major economic crises. First in 1837 through 39, then even worse in 1842, the crisis that initiated the Hungry 40s, the first Great Depression in the history of capitalism. The Chartists met the frustration of their demands with violent uprisings and were met with repression in turn, leading to a division within the movement between the right wing that sought to win the Charter through moral force alone and the left wing that refused to renounce physical force. It was around this time that Engels first arrived in Manchester, quickly being drawn into both the Owenite and Chartist circles and contributing to their respective periodicals about developments on the continent and reporting on the developments in England for the Rheinische Zeitung. In France, following the Revolution of 1830, in which the bourgeoisie regained power with the support of the working classes, only for the fruits of the revolution to fall to the middle classes only, the working men got up several insurrections for the abolition of political monopoly and the establishment of a republic, but were always defeated. The middle class having not only the army on their side, but forming themselves the National Guard besides. These insurrections had been organized by various revolutionary conspiracies, secret societies inspired by the Jacobins and Babeuf's conspiracy, whose most notorious leader was the French revolutionary Louis-Auguste Blanqui. The League of the Just was one such organization formed by German emigre artisans. Yet multiple failed insurrections soured many to the notion of political revolution altogether, including the members of the League. While still not just the failed insurrections, but also the betrayals of the revolution from within, of course. While still pursuing communism as their ultimate goal, they began to turn to the ideas of the French socialists Henri de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier, and their respective followers, though neither had advocated community of property. During democracy as a dead end, they began to pursue social revolution through directly social means, similar to the Owenite propaganda, cooperatives, and colonies, and formed public workers' educational associations to that end. Especially influential were the Christian-inspired communist colonialism of Etienne Cabet, which inspired Wilhelm Weitling's communist doctrine, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a follower of Saint-Simon who opposed such communism, as well as trade unionism, in favor of a socialism based on worker cooperatives and exchange mediated by labor notes. When Marx and Engels met in Paris in August of 1844, they had each come to see socialism and communism as giving intellectual expression to the crisis of the bourgeois revolution, a crisis manifest in the backward character of Germany and its own bourgeoisie. This crisis was embodied in the condition of the proletariat, whose emancipation was impossible under the rule of the bourgeoisie, but whose struggle for emancipation was an inevitable consequence of the development of bourgeois society. Moreover, while this crisis led the bourgeois revolutions to fall short of the radical aspirations of their plebeian supporters by driving the bourgeoisie toward conservatism, it also stoked the radicalism of the working classes and destabilized the existing social and political order, leading to renewed revolutionary upsurges. These revolutions had never been merely national affairs, but manifested within each nation and in the relations between nations, culminating in wars between the forces of revolution and the forces of counter-revolution, civil wars and international wars, spanning not only Europe, but spreading across the globe and drawing peoples all over the world into the fray. The fate of the revolution of Europe had been, and would be again, the fate of humanity as a whole. They expected the revolution to begin in France and to quickly spread to Germany. Germany would have the crucial role of obstructing the forces of counter-revolution by breaking the alliance of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and isolating Russia through the emancipation of Poland, Poland being the keystone of the counter-revolutionary alliance. Revolution on the continent would inevitably draw Britain into the fray and thus set the stage for a political crisis in which the Chartists would inevitably be raised to power, inaugurating the epoch of proletarian revolution. That was the general outlines of their vision of how they imagined things would proceed. The proletariat would have a crucial role to play in this imminent revolution as the most radical far left wing of the Democratic Party that would ultimately be thrust into power as the more moderate parties proved unable to resolve the crisis and discredited themselves. Marx and Engels saw the task of the proletarian socialists, the communists, to clarify this historical mission as a necessary implication of their conditions, their existing course of struggle, and their immediate aims. As they wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only: One, in the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. And two, in the various stages of the development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, and hence a political party, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would be universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The task facing Marx and Engels, therefore, was to help forge this communist party, to help the proletariat organize itself into a distinct political party by clarifying the conditions and necessary course of their struggle. In the organization of this party, and as I've mentioned before, party has to be understood here not in the sense of a single, unified, exclusive membership organization, but in a more general sense of people devoted to the same political end and organized in various ways for the sake of achieving that end. And generally speaking, um, working under the same banner as represented by a common program or set of demands, and as explicated in the various literary organs, typically newspapers and pamphlets and uh, the various outputs of publishing enterprises and so on. On that point, um, in the organization of this party understood as an activity, the organization of the party as an activity, so not organization in the sense of something, a kind of institution, but an ongoing activity, or set of activities. In the organization of this party understood as an activity, a process of interaction between distinct elements. They would thus dialectically mediate between their own theoretical consciousness and their distinctive theoretical practice of writing, speaking, publishing, teaching, and the practical consciousness of the proletarians engaged in active struggle with the theoretical perspective they had been developing in the course of this struggle. As Engels put it with respect to England, the Chartists are theoretically the more backward, the less developed, but they are genuine proletarians all over, the representatives of their class. He's distinguishing here between the socialists, the non-political socialists, and the Chartists. So the Chartists are the more theoretically backward, the less developed, but they are genuine proletarians all over, the representatives of their class. The socialists are more far-seeing, propose practical remedies against distress, but proceeding originally from the bourgeoisie, are for this reason unable to amalgamate completely with the working class. The union of socialism with Chartism, the reproduction of French communism in an English manner, will be the next step and has already begun. They thus threw themselves into the existing movement by attending and participating in meetings of workers' associations and democratic associations, speaking and lecturing, publishing their views in newspapers and pamphlets. In 1846, they formed the Communist Correspondence Committee, which would maintain regular contact between the leading communists in various countries in order to hash out theoretical differences through circular letters and ultimately in a periodical publication. This led them into conflict with unpolitical socialists who recoiled from the revolution in the name of purely social action, like Proudhon, democratic socialists like Louis Blanc, who believed the Democratic Party would, once in power, pursue social reforms that would redress the social question without the need for a separate proletarian party and proletarian revolution. And worst of all, the German true socialists that advocated an alliance between the working class and the reactionary state against the liberals and Democrats on the basis that the state would reward the workers for their loyalty with the desired social reforms. That was, for Marx and Engels, the worst tendency that needed to be most vigorously combated. And this is my conclusion, and then I'll stop. Yet in 1847, they had impressed the leadership of the League of the Just, who increasingly saw the turn toward purely social action as little better than their earlier pursuit of revolution through Blanquist conspiracy, and embraced the notion championed by Marx and Engels that they should orient toward the organization of workers' educational associations and the production of literature for public distribution, thereby organizing the proletarian wing of the Democratic Party and preparing it for its role in the coming revolution. They participated in its reorganization as the Communist League, or, well, technically Marx was not there, Engels was there on his behalf, but they participated jointly through Engels, and were tasked with writing its program, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which Marx finished writing in January of 1848. As the first edition of the pamphlet was coming off the press the following month, revolution erupted in Paris. And that's the end of the lecture. So, okay, sorry to throw a curveball and actually not give the promised lecture, but essentially the rest of the previous lecture. But I thought it was necessary. So,
Reid, that was fabulous. You've got a question straight off the bat. Danny?
okay.
Yeah, well, I thank you, Reid, again. No, I mean, this is good that it's. I'm trying to think of sort of the trajectory. Like, in other words, I know where you're going in terms of 1848, for example. I think that's coming next week.
Yeah.
And I was talking to somebody, and they were like, "What is Marx and Engels' view of like bourgeois society, right? Don't we have all of these them?" Like the calumnies they throw upon the bourgeoisie of like, oh, this is bourgeois, blah, 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 things like that. And I guess I was hoping today there would be a little bit of 1848, because in a sense, what they're judging is the way in which 1848 is falling below already what was kind of established in the history of revolutions that they had studied. Meaning when Marx is studying, as a young Hegelian, he's also studying the history of the convention, right? I think this is like something Mayrang and probably Ryazanov bring up. And you're also brought up Buonarroti, right? In other words, this idea of their kind of political strategy going into 1848. And I know that isn't quite there right now, that an extreme left party is going to come out. And so the extreme left wing of democracy. But I guess I bring that up to say, to what extent are they grasping capitalism? I guess we're ending at the Communist Manifesto right here, as a regression of bourgeois society. It seems like at first it's looking like Germany is lagging, right? Because, this whole history, the 30 Years' War and whatever, they're not near the Atlantic as much as England is, and they're kind of latecomers and don't have the same development of a middle class. But to what degree are they recognizing like already the inability to carry out kind of a basic bourgeois revolution, and as that reflecting not simply the timidness, I don't know what kind of language they would use, like, you're a coward or something, or like, it's a talk shop. We're not even at the Frankfurt talk shop yet of 1848. We're just prior to that.
Philistinism.
Philistine, yeah. I guess I'm trying to get at that. Like with the young Hegelians, they're also falling below basic bourgeois society, as he'll just lecture to them like, oh, don't you know the revolution was the separation of civil society from the political sphere. So why are you turning to these quasi, like that were on the Jewish question? This was like Marx's critique there. So I guess I was trying to bring up if you can get at that side of Marx and Engels as kind of the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution, right? Meaning, like, in other words, like without them, it might not even be clear there. And I know next week when you talk about 1848, when Marx is writing to Biedermeier and saying, look, I'm not the first person to talk about class struggle. This has been there with Thierry and Guizot, and I'm sure, Marx and Engels are reading them in the 1840s already.
Yep.
Does that question make sense? It's a kind of difficult thing to talk about without the spectacular failure of 1848, of this way in which it's falling below a classic bourgeois revolution.
Yeah, that was we think a lot alike, Danny, because that was that so this lecture, this was really the second half of what was supposed to be the previous lecture, or not even half, like the last third. A significant portion of that was to be devoted to just this question, specifically through the question of philosophy, the relation to Hegel, the relation to the other young Hegelians. And for that matter, in case it's not, you probably know this, but for anyone watching or listening, quite a lot of what I was quoting there from Marx and Engels, or from Marx in particular, was drawn from The Holy Family, the pamphlet written against Bruno Bauer and his circle in 1845, it was actually written in the second half of 1844, but published in 1845, in which he is essentially clarifying these questions, the question of the history of the bourgeois revolution, and various other subjects, in polemicizing against the distortions that are exhibited by Bauer's writing at the time, which was very condescending. So generally speaking, I felt a little bit okay leaving a lot of this out because it will come back in the next lecture, specifically in the question of the failure of 1848, which Marx and Engels, especially Marx, had a pretty well developed sense of that possibility coming out of the previous history. Now, of course, there is a difference, namely that there had not been a proletarian party before. The closest thing you have to that would be like Babeuf in the 1790s, or the various Blanquist groups in the 1830s and so on. But at least in terms of the continent, you don't yet have anything like a proletarian party forming. So that's like the major difference there. But nonetheless, Marx was kind of, so let me just reframe this a little bit. The way I conceived of the kind of arc of this argument over the course of the first few lectures was that Marx was already, in his earliest writing, substantial writing, namely his doctoral dissertation, and the notebooks in preparation for it, he already had clearly in mind the idea that Hegel's philosophical accomplishment in having, in Hegel's own conception, completed philosophy, meant that because in Hegel's mind, as well as Marx's, and Marx certainly never gave up this aspect of Hegelianism, because philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought, because the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk, there is a sense in which philosophy, like the kind of culmination of the philosophy of an epoch, reflects the culmination of that epoch. It reflects, in a sense, on the one hand, the summarizing of everything that had come before, including not only the philosophy that had come before, but all of the developments of society, history, etc., that had come before. But also the exhaustion of a certain potential that had been driving that process forward. So the problem for Marx, even before, even in his dissertation, is what does it mean to be a Hegelian after Hegel? Because it can't just mean like continuing to propagate the system as if history comes to an end, because of course it had come to an end. And in Hegel's own mind, that wasn't the case. I mean, there may be a sense in which he thinks that way, but that's really only one side of it. The other side of it is, of course, there's inevitably after night has come to an end, the owl of Minerva must return to her roost, and then the sun breaks the horizon and a new day begins. Right? Marx uses this language in his dissertation, and that's why he chose that subject matter, the so-called philosophies of self-consciousness after Aristotle, because he was looking at Aristotle and the relation of the Hellenistic philosophy to Aristotle as an analogy to his own position in relation to Hegel. So in a sense, the point would be philosophy is no longer adequate, but how does that inadequacy manifest within philosophy? And what does that mean for someone that has learned philosophy? Like, what happens next? Of course, what happened next in the Greek world, the major development, philosophically speaking, is not really a philosophical development at all. It's not Epicureanism or Stoicism or eclectic academicism or Neoplatonism or any of these things, but it's the kind of fusion of them all into a very unphilosophical enterprise, namely the founding of the Christian religion. And that's Bauer's perspective, of course. So, and Marx and Engels agree with that. So then the question becomes, what does it mean to make the world philosophical? What does it mean for philosophy to become worldly? What do you do with the Hegelian philosophy after its world has come into crisis? And of course, it's not crisis immediately in his mind, or it maybe is, but not in a kind of really radical sense. It's more, it initially has more the character of an incomplete task, the incomplete task of liberal reformism, that Hegel was a part of this liberal reform movement. That's where Marx kind of begins his journalistic career, is as a liberal reformer seeking to raise that banner in under very adverse circumstances, which is also what the young Hegelian movement as a whole was doing, although it was primarily doing so under the guise of the critique of religion, or not really the guise. Engels, I think, describes it as in later in life as it was kind of it was almost as if they were using the critique of religion as a critique of politics because they couldn't directly critique politics. And that's true. But there's also a sense in which the critique of religion itself had an important function because religion had a political function. So it's a little more complicated than that. But really, the developments of the period of 1842 to 1844, culminating in his arrival in Paris and the development of his perspective in Paris, really forces him to rethink how he was trying to square things beforehand, which is essentially.
On this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I know you mentioned earlier the 18th century. So the American Revolution is like a crisis of the English Revolution, which you can read with someone like Pitt the Younger saying, look, what's happening in America is what we fought for in the 17th century, right? I think you mentioned this in your description. Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith is trying to continue the bourgeois revolution, kind of ongoing global thing. Same with Kant and Hegel then later as well. The reason I'm bringing that up is I'm trying to get at the transition from Marx and Engels maybe saying or thinking, I'm not going to say saying, thinking, okay, we're continuing that revolution in a kind of straightforward sense, like in the way that Adam Smith and Kant are expressions of a crisis, not in the self-contradiction of bourgeois society, but in the crisis, the necessity of freedom of completing the revolt of the third estate.
Right.
And Marx and Engels, I think to me, the earliest Engels that I know where he mentions the proletariat, he just kind of refers to it as the progressive side is showing itself through the lower classes. It's like in one of these early 1841, 1842 pieces. But then you can get Marx a few years later saying, no, the proletariat's the dissolution of society. or you were quoting from the Holy Family, where it's like they're the absolute negation of humanity. And you see what I'm saying? Like there's a change from, is the revolution just being pushed forward by this kind of plebeian element, to no, this is actually a crisis of the ongoing revolution. Like that's what I wanted to get at.
Yeah. It's hard because a lot of this discussion anticipates the next lecture, and a lot of it I have developed at great length, and I was trying to summarize that a moment ago. But it's it would take at least another hour to really get into the details of it. But the point I was trying to make is right before Marx arrives in Paris, when he's writing to Ruga and all of that, and he's preparing his notebook, his manuscript of what he had envisioned to be the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he never actually produces. He's trying to make sense of his experience as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung and his broader understanding of history at that point. And he's groping towards something. There's something in there, but it's very. He really ends up coming down on a criticism of Hegel for his kind of theoretical standpoint. In a sense, Hegel doesn't understand. In a sense, he basically says Hegel remained in this philosophical position that I'm trying to go beyond, and that's the problem with not only Hegel, but Hegel as in a sense the furthest intellectual development of the German liberal movement. So it's kind of a critique of both himself and of the other young Hegelians and of German liberalism more generally, through Hegel. It's only when he gets to Paris that he really starts to understand that he really starts to understand, I think, Hegel in particular, but also the critique he's trying to formulate, which is that that Hegel, in a sense, embodied the limitations of his moment, but that's not his fault, right? In a sense, that's his virtue, that he shows the limitations of his moment from a retrospective standpoint. Of course, that didn't look like limitations at the time. It looked like the most profound accomplishment. And you could say the same not just of Hegel, but of other great bourgeois. You could say the same about Adam Smith, for example. So yes, I mean, it does come down to this question of self-contradiction, because the contradiction within the bourgeois revolution before this point is not the self-contradiction of bourgeois society. It's the self-contradiction of feudal society, if you will. It's not really the right way to think about it, but another way to think about it is it's kind of a self-contradiction of civilization, of the history of civilization, that culminates in this moment, in the conflict between this newly emerging world and the old world. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to add in, like, in other words, Adam Smith is saying, like, if we've had this revolution, we ought to complete it, right? Otherwise, it's going to be, a nation of shopkeepers or something. That's how he put it.
Right. We ought to complete the revolution. But the thing, and this is the point I was trying to get at with Babeuf, in particular, that it's not simply a matter of completing the revolution, but also of going beyond it, of sublating it, dialectically sublating the society that the revolution is establishing. Because bourgeois society, this is part of the problem, is there's a conception of bourgeois society as a kind of society, which it is, but what it really is the disintegration of all of the old forms of society. Of course, commerce, trade, industry, in the sense of, manufacturing in general, not by means of machinery, but in, handicraft, production in general. These go back to the beginning of civilization. They're not new. Commodity production, even wage labor, none of these things are new. What's new is the form they take after the 14th century. where they become the dominant aspects of society, whereas they'd always been marginal elements linking together the great, civilizations, or the great, the holdings of the barbarian warlords, however you want to look at it. So it's really that what looks from a vulgar romantic perspective, as using those terms, a kind of vulgar bourgeois perspective, what looks like not only a new form of society, but really like the pinnacle of social existence, and a return to the natural way of organizing society, as opposed to the unnatural and undesirable forms that characterize history. That this apparent form of society is really a form of disintegration, and that's of course how Marx describes it in the Communist Manifesto, that all that is solid melts into air, etc. And I will go into this more in the next lecture, but it's really the process by which everything that has happened to humanity since the Neolithic Revolution is, on the one hand, undoing itself. And that's why it looks like a return to what presumably preceded that whole development, which from a bourgeois perspective is seen in an abstract way, right? So like the Robinsonade, state of nature, the state of nature as the isolated individual wandering through the forest, or what have you, which, of course, was not Rousseau's point. It's not like he thought that was actually how people lived. He even says as much in the Discourse on Inequality. He says, effectively, this is an idea that he's explicit about what had been implicit previously, namely that I'm posing this idea for the sake of criticizing society, right? So he's in a sense extracting this image society has of its own foundation, its own nature, and using it to critique that society. But that same image is transformed after Rousseau in various thinkers, culminating in the Cercle Social, into a kind of a communist state of nature, primitive communism, which, real or not, the idea would be all of human history is now being undone. So we're being thrown back on this primitive condition of the community. But on the other hand, it's not really undoing everything. It's building something new on these foundations. But in order to do that, everything has to be uprooted so that it can be reconstructed, so that it can be transformed. So that's in. And so then, yes, the proletariat embodies this disillusion for Marx. But in experiencing that disillusion, they have the ability, at least potentially, and they exhibit this ability in Paris, in London, in Manchester. Marx and Engels see it. They embody this ability to see beyond the existing society, not in the sense of knowing what will ultimately come out of it, but in seeing the necessity of going through this process in order to overcome it, rather than trying to put a stop to it or just live with it or something like that. Make it comfortable through poor relief, for example, which is, this is really, again, I can't emphasize enough how the core problem for Marx within the socialist movement, it's not the democratic socialists. It's not even the kind of anarchists, the anti-political socialists. It's the reactionary socialist. And not in the sense of like Thomas Carlyle or something, but in the sense of the people in the proletarian movement that are sowing illusions in the reactionary state. That, for Marx and Engels, is the fundamental problem that needs to be criticized. And that's why pretty much all of their activity, or a great deal of their activity leading up to 1848, is devoted to excoriating the true socialists, or the people they deem to be true socialists within this movement. So,
Reid, thank you so much. You've really given us the perfect note to end on. And yeah, we'll look forward to next week's penultimate meeting, building on exactly that last point on working towards total victory in principle, the critique of political economy and the self-emancipation of the working class. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll pick it up there.
Thank you, Jacob.